Welcome to the Just Word Podcast. I'm Pat Bolland. The Just Word Podcast is brought to you by Justwealth, investing the way it should be, just for you. Artificial intelligence. Cheaper. Sometimes I wish I just had some, but Peter Voss actually is the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Scientist at AIgo.ai. And that AI stands for artificial intelligence. He's one of the best in the world, and he joins us. Peter, a real pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, Peter, let's start with the real basics, because I don't understand sometimes what's going on with artificial intelligence. And you also have introduced another term called artificial in general intelligence. So I need to know the difference between those two, if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely. The term artificial intelligence is actually quite confusing, because if you go back to the original meaning of AI, when the term was coined some 60 odd years ago, it was really about building machines that can think and learn and reason the way humans do. The kind of AI you see in the movies, where you can actually have a full conversation, understands, has its own motivation, it can do jobs for you. And unfortunately, in the movies, often it's then tries to do bad things, So that was the original meaning of AI. And 60 years ago, they thought they could build machines like that, within a few years. Now, it turned out to be much, much, much harder than that. So what happened over the years, the field of AI has really changed into solving very specific, narrow problems. So instead of having this general human-like AI, or intelligence, you have machines that solve programs that solve very specific problems, very narrowly. So a good example here is when IBM built a Deep Blue, which became the world chess champion. It was a specific system built to be very good at playing chess. Now, that's all it can do. It can't play checkers. It can't, do trip planning or do anything at all.
Right. So is that what we, sorry to interrupt, Peter, but
yeah.
Is that what we would now call machine learning?
Well, it's morphed into machine learning is really the part that's exploded over the last 10 years or so. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But yes, exactly. So it's solving one particular problem, but there's actually a deeper issue involved here, and that is that the intelligence actually resides in the programmer much more than in the program. So the original idea of AI was that the program has the intelligence to, learn how to play chess and solve other problems, and, like a human, basically learn new skills and solve problems. Whereas with narrow AI, the programmer figures out how can we use computer technology to solve one particular problem. So that's narrow AI.
But the bias creeps in. So what you're saying is garbage in, garbage out kind of a
analogy. Well, that too, but you have that problem. You really have that problem for people as well,
Yeah, true.
So now you talk about machine learning. So over the last 10 years, big companies figured out how they could use massive amounts of data that they'd accumulated and massive amounts of computing power, like obviously Google and Amazon, how to use that to build models that can solve, computer models that could solve particular problems, such as image recognition. How to recognize a person or a motor car or something, which is of course used in autonomous cars, or how to recognize speech. And that's become incredibly successful in a number of areas. But again, it's narrow AI. It's solving one particular problem, one particular class of problems. And a lot of that intelligence, again, is external. It's in the data scientist in figuring out what data to collect, how to mark up the data, how to specifically train it. And it's then using the computer technology to solve that particular problem. So again, if you have a system that can become the world champion in Go, if you change the rules of the game, it can't cope with that. It wouldn't. It wouldn't be able to do anything that it hasn't been specifically trained on. So it's this trend of going towards narrow AI that's been very successful in solving a number of problems, like targeted advertising, to the bane to all of us, but of course incredibly lucrative, for companies developing this sort of targeted advertising using machine learning. But a number of us, a small number of people, actually want to recapture the original ambition and the original dream of AI, to build thinking machines that actually have the intelligence inside them to learn new things, to solve new problems, and to be able to think and reason like humans. So in 2001, I actually got together with a number of other people with that idea, and we coined the term artificial general intelligence, or AGI, to basically talk about that type of general AI. And that term has actually become quite generally accepted, surprisingly. But it's still a very small number of people actually working on what you could also look at the real AI, or the original AI.
Okay. How is AI different than your or my brain?
Well, from a brain point of view, it's very, very different. Of course, our brains are, biological material, built from biological material, and, designed, if we can use the word, designed by evolution, or formed by evolution over millions of years. Whereas an artificial brain uses computer technology, and it's engineers who are building it. So it's really very, very different. Now, having said that, there is definitely inspiration and ideas we get from the way our brains solve intelligence. And so even to the terminology that people now talk about, neural networks, like neurons being connected together. And so that's a useful model. And in fact, what we do is we have these artificial neural networks, but realistically, they are very, very different from the way neurons work in our brains. So it's really more understanding what intelligence is, and what thinking is, really more how our mind works. So you want an artificial mind, you want a mind that can think and reason and learn the way humans do, but done in a very, very different way. Now, I think a reasonable analogy here is flight. We've had flying machines for over 100 years now. We are still nowhere near reverse engineering a bird, so you could say, are we building flying machines that are like birds? Well, not really, but it's a flight part we want to achieve, and we've been successful in doing that, but not in the same way that birds do it, not the same way that, again, evolution and biology have solved the problem of flight. So in that same way, we want to solve the problem of intelligence, or the requirements of intelligence, not in the way nature did it, but using the tools and materials that we have available to us.
It was funny you mentioned that. The early iterations of flight were Leonardo da Vinci, and he actually did try to redesign the bird, but obviously it didn't work out, and we use a more structured vehicle as it stands currently. Let's get to a practical component. I've driven a Tesla, for instance, and it would represent, I think, machine learning. It was able, in a rush hour situation, to change lanes, for instance. And this was a few years ago, so this is old technology. But what we run into on a more ubiquitous basis, I think, a lot of people, is when they go to sign in to access their account at some kind of a service, they get a thing on the side called a chatbot. And these things seem to be more and more intelligent. Would you consider those artificial intelligence?
Yes, certainly. And so again, there are distinctions to be made. First of all, when you have this little window pop up, you may actually be talking to a human. So typically, if you have a really good experience, then there's a good chance there's a human actually giving you the answers on the other side. But Again, there's sort of the narrow AI approach, which is, keyword spotting, what keywords are you using? And, you can see the same thing in Alexa and Siri. If, for example, I say, don't ever give me Uber again. I hate Uber, don't ever give me Uber again. It'll probably pop up the Uber app because it recognizes Uber and says, well, that's probably
exactly
what you
don't want.
Right. So, there is no real deep understanding. So a lot of the chatbots and a lot of frustrations that people have with chatbots are that they're not intelligent. They don't really understand you deeply. It's just like keyword spotting. And then they put you through some kind of a like step-by-step flowchart process, ask you questions, yes or no, or enter this and so on. But anything that wasn't anticipated, it goes off the rails very quickly, and that's because they really don't understand. They don't have memory. They don't remember what was said earlier. So that's a typical chatbot you have. And what we are introducing is a chatbot with a brain, so that there is actually deep understanding, that it remembers what you said earlier in the conversation, or even in a previous conversation, that it can apply some common sense to what the conversation is about or what you want, and can reason about things. So that's kind of the upgrade you're really hoping for, is to have a chatbot with a brain, as opposed to just, a chatbot that just has keyword recognition and takes you through a flowchart. Now, having said that, there are applications, if you just want your bank balance, sure. You don't need a lot of sophistication, but then people would typically just go to the website anyway to get that. It's usually more complex things you want to do when you activate a chatbot.
Okay, and that's what you do at AIgo.ai?
Yes, yeah, that's what we do.
Okay, against that background, how will the client experience change, do you think, if you get your way?
Well, we talk to a lot of large companies, and most of them are actually very disappointed and frustrated with their chatbot implementations that they have, because they don't have good customer uptake. One of the biggest banks have like a 2% uptake of a system they developed for tens of millions of dollars, or even hundreds, because the system really doesn't have a brain, it doesn't understand. So, imagine you talking to a human, or you have a personal assistant, and they didn't remember what you said 2 sentences ago, or they just didn't pay attention and just kind of took keywords that they hear, and try and answer something. That wouldn't be very satisfying. So what customers really want, and therefore the companies providing service, is something that can be hyper personalized. It can have deep understanding and also remember you. And one of our clients is 1-800-Flowers, and what they were looking for is to put a chatbot in that's more like a concierge, that knows each individual. It knows what your preferences are, who you buy gifts for, what kind of things you like, and people you buy them for, what they like, what the status is of your various orders, and so on. And it can proactively, it can talk to you like a service agent who really knows about you. In fact, better than a service agent, because it'll have perfect memory and perfect recall of what your situation is. So that is, I think, what customers ultimately would like, is to have this hyper personalized assistant, whether that's for help with your cable service, then you're troubleshooting it, and it might recommend, well, reboot your router. Now, next time you call in or you contact it, it wouldn't ask you the same thing again, like we have now. Every time you call in, well, have you tried rebooting the router? Yes, I've tried that 3 times.
Right.
Okay, why don't you try and move it into the kitchen? See if that'll work. And then you call back and say, well, did that work? So having that hyper personalized service, I think, is really ultimately what people want, and the company is serving them.
You know, Peter, in my mind's eye, what I'm seeing is the movies and Iron Man and Tony
Mhm.
Stark talking into his helmet, and I forget
Of
the name
course.
of the butler that he has there.
Mhm.
One area that I thought would be perfect for AI, and I've been disappointed, it's the wrong word, but surprised that
Mhm.
it hasn't moved into, is finances and investing. How do you see that playing out over time?
Yes, it's the same thing as, again, having a chatbot with a brain, that can really understand and reason and have common sense and know what it's doing. So it's that's really what we're looking for going forward. Now, financial institutions obviously have the additional requirements of, security and liability that they might have if the system gives you bad advice or wrong advice or whatever. So there are those additional considerations, but it's still having that hyper personalized service that it's a perfect application for that knows what kind of investments you currently have, what your profile is, the kind of risk profile you have, all of those kind of things, your prior transactions, taking that into account. And incidentally, what we often find, and research has found, is that there are a lot of areas that people actually prefer to talk to a computer if it can do the job than to talk to a human, because there might be, it might be something they're embarrassed about, or they don't want to waste a human's time, talking endlessly with something they may not understand very well. And they don't want to bother somebody with that, so, or as I say, they might just not feel comfortable talking to people. Obviously, medical conditions are like that, but I think financial situations also fall into that category. So absolutely, we will see, I think, significant improvements going forward as we have more chatbots with a brain.
It seems to me that there are limitless applications for artificial intelligence, AGI in your particular
Mhm.
case. What's missing as it stands currently, and how quickly is the space evolving?
So, from my perspective, what is missing is that not enough people are working on AGI. And it's sort of an accident of history in a way that deep learning, machine learning has become so incredibly successful over a short period of time because there are a few large companies that have massive amounts of data and massive amounts of computing power. They are now building models of literally hundreds of billions or trillion words and parameters that they get from everything from internet, Wikipedia, and so on. And they build these massive statistical models that can actually have very impressive conversations that sound very intelligent. But when you scratch below the surface, there's nothing there. There's no understanding. They can't actually be used for things like we were talking about, for customer service or so. But because it's been so impressive in areas such as targeted advertising and image recognition and so on, all the money is flowing into that area, into this narrow AI, deep learning, machine learning. So I think the biggest advances we'll see as more focus shifts to AGI, where people are saying we really need the intelligence in the system and not the person building the model, solving the particular problems, that we don't solve one problem at a time with external intelligence, but that we solve the problem of building a machine that has true intelligence internally. As soon as we get more money flowing into that, at the moment, the less than 1% of all the AI funding goes into that.
Okay, final question then, Peter. If AI does advance, how do we stop it from being bad? As you said at the beginning, the movies always have it as bad.
Well, it's unfortunate, but obviously it makes supposedly for a better movie. I was asked once to consult on an AI movie, and I went through the script and made certain suggestions, and I said, but wouldn't this be a much better story if the ending was like humans and AIs work together, and we had utopia with that. And no, they weren't interested in that. That movie wouldn't sell. So I think there's a big gap between the perception of AI has to be bad when it becomes really intelligent with the reality. AIs aren't going to have that reptile brain that humans suffer from, that we have problems with ego. And, of course, evolution designed us to focus on reproduction and survival. That's what is very inherent, of course, in our sort of animal nature. And our rationality civilizes us, is essentially. Now, an AI isn't going to have that starting point of being built to survive and reproduce. It's going to be fundamentally built to be intelligent and to do things for human. That'll be its, DNA, if you want to call it that. That'll be its purpose and its DNA. So I don't have any reason to believe that an AI will, have any other motivation than that. Now, it's a very complex topic, of course, and I've actually written quite extensively about the issues of free will and about consciousness and ethics. How do we know right from wrong, and how will computers know right from wrong? And I think there are actually some pretty good answers, and in my mind, they all point towards AIs, AGIs, helping us to improve our lives significantly.
We could have a discussion forever on the reptilian mind. Great descriptor. Peter, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. This was fun.
Peter Voss. He's the CEO and chief scientist at AIgo.ai.